What if I told you that before Aragorn ever laid eyes on Gollum, the wretched creature had already been captured, tortured, and broken by the Dark Lord himself? This is the story that changed everything, the forgotten chapter that made Sauron's return possible and set the entire War of the Ring in motion. Most fans know about the hunt for Gollum, where Aragorn tracked down the creature after 17 years of pursuit. But few realize that Sauron and his forces were the first to capture Gollum, decades before Aragorn ever took up the trail. This wasn't just a simple interrogation. This was a systematic breaking of a tortured soul that would have consequences, reaching across all of Middle-earth. In our previous video, we covered how Aragorn captured Gollum in the Dead Marshes, but today we're going back further, to the dark years when Barad-dur's dungeons echoed with screams that would doom the free peoples. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one creature's capture became the key that nearly unlocked Sauron's total victory. So, hit that subscribe button. We're about to descend into the very heart of darkness itself. After losing his precious ring to Bilbo Baggins in the Goblin Tunnels, Gollum entered the darkest period of his already cursed existence. The creature that had once been Smeagol was now consumed by a singular obsession, finding his lost treasure. But this wasn't aimless wandering. Over the decades following Bilbo's escape, Gollum's fragmented memories began to coalesce around crucial details. He remembered the riddle game, the invisible thief, and most importantly, he remembered a word that had escaped in his rage: Baggins. This name became both his torment and his hope. Somewhere out there was a creature called Baggins who had stolen his precious, and Gollum would not rest until he found them. What made Gollum so dangerous wasn't just his obsession, but his intelligence. Despite his apparent madness, he retained the cunning that had allowed him to survive for centuries in the wild places of Middle-earth. He began actively investigating, questioning other creatures, and piecing together information about hobbits and their homeland. The creature learned that hobbits were small, peaceful folk who lived in a place called the Shire. He discovered that Baggins was a family name, and that there were many who bore it. Most dangerously of all, he began to understand that his ring, his precious, was no ordinary treasure. The way it had made him invisible, the way it had preserved his life, the way he could feel its absence like a physical wound, all of this suggested something far more significant than a simple magic ring. During these years of searching, Gollum was unaware that he wasn't the only one seeking the ring. Far to the south, in the fires of Mount Doom, an ancient evil was stirring. Sauron had returned to Mordor, and with his return came a growing network of spies, servants, and creatures bent to his will. The Dark Lord's search for his lost ring was systematic and far-reaching. Where Gollum searched with the desperation of obsession, Sauron searched with the cold calculation of centuries-old intelligence. His servants were everywhere, in the wild places, in the towns and cities, even in the courts of kings. And eventually, inevitably, these two searches would intersect. By the time of Gollum's capture, Sauron's spy network had grown to encompass much of Middle-earth. This wasn't the crude surveillance of orcs and goblins, but a sophisticated intelligence operation that included corrupted men, fallen wizards, and creatures bound to the Dark Lord's will. These agents reported everything: unusual activities, strange creatures, and most importantly, any mention of rings of power. The network operated on multiple levels. At the lowest level were the orcs and goblins who served as muscle and basic reconnaissance. Above them were the more intelligent creatures, trolls, wargs, and corrupted men who could gather more sophisticated intelligence. At the highest level were beings like the Nazgul, who could coordinate operations and follow complex leads. The first reports of a strange creature obsessed with a precious ring began filtering back to Barad-dur around the time of Sauron's return to physical form. These reports came from various sources: goblins who had encountered Gollum in the tunnels, creatures who had been questioned by him, and spies who had observed his erratic behavior. Initially, these reports were just one thread among many in the vast web of intelligence flowing to Mordor. But as more reports accumulated, a pattern began to emerge. This wasn't just another corrupted creature of the wild. This was someone with specific knowledge about a ring of power. More importantly, this creature seemed to have lost such a ring and was desperately seeking its return. The moment when Sauron realized that Gollum might possess knowledge of the One Ring was a turning point in the hidden war. The Dark Lord had spent centuries wondering what had become of his greatest creation. He knew it hadn't been destroyed. He would have felt that. He knew it hadn't been claimed by another of sufficient power. He would have sensed that as well. But where it had gone remained a mystery that had tormented him since his defeat. The reports of Gollum's behavior, his obsession with a lost precious, and most tellingly, his use of the word thief to describe whoever had taken it, suggested a crucial possibility. This creature might be the key to finding the One Ring, but to extract that information would require more than simple interrogation. It would require the full resources of Barad-dur's dungeons. Once Sauron identified Gollum as a priority target, the full weight of Mordor's intelligence apparatus focused on his capture. This wasn't a random search, but a coordinated campaign involving multiple groups of hunters operating across a vast area. The Dark Lord couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip away. The hunters included specialized tracking units of orcs, led by more intelligent creatures capable of following subtle trails. They were supported by aerial reconnaissance from fell beasts and coordinated by Nazgul, who could cover vast distances quickly. Most importantly, they had something Aragorn lacked in his later hunt. They knew approximately where to look and had multiple teams searching simultaneously. Gollum's capture didn't happen by chance. It was the result of his own obsession drawing him inexorably toward danger. After losing the ring to Bilbo, his desperate search had led him far from his familiar haunts in the Misty Mountains. His quest for information about Baggins and the ring's location drew him ever southward until he found himself on the very borders of Mordor itself. The creature's journey to this forbidden land wasn't random. Mordor had a pull on all things touched by the ring's power, and Gollum, having possessed it for centuries, was inevitably drawn to Sauron's realm. Here, in the shadow of Barad-dur, he encountered the monstrous spider Shelob and became her spy, worshipping her and bringing her food in exchange for protection and information. The actual capture came when Gollum ventured too close to Sauron's borders in his desperate search for information. The outskirts of Mordor were heavily patrolled by the Dark Lord's forces, and no creature could long remain hidden in that accursed land. Sauron's orcs, operating in their own territory with overwhelming numbers, finally cornered the wretched creature. When the trap was finally sprung, Gollum found himself overwhelmed on the very doorstep of the Dark Tower. The creature who had evaded capture for decades was no match for Sauron's forces, operating in their own stronghold. Despite his unnatural strength and agility, he couldn't escape the coordinated hunt of creatures who knew every path and hiding place in the wasteland of Mordor. The journey from the Misty Mountains to Barad-dur was itself a form of torture for Gollum. The creature, who had spent centuries in darkness, was dragged across the wasteland of Mordor under the burning eye of Sauron's watchful gaze. Every step took him further from any hope of escape and closer to a fate he couldn't imagine. The escort was massive and well coordinated, reflecting the importance Sauron placed on this prisoner. Multiple units of orcs surrounded the captive, while Nazgul flew overhead to prevent any rescue attempts. The very landscape of Mordor seemed hostile to the wretched creature, and the growing sense of malevolent power became overwhelming as they approached the Dark Tower. When Gollum was finally brought before Barad-dur, the sight of Sauron's fortress broke what remained of his spirit before the interrogation even began. The Dark Tower was more than just a physical structure. It was a manifestation of Sauron's will, a concentration of malevolent power that crushed hope and resistance. The creature, who had once ruled the goblins through cunning and violence, was reduced to a gibbering wretch in the shadow of the Dark Tower. The very air seemed poisonous to him, and the constant sense of being watched by an intelligence beyond his comprehension began the process of breaking down his mental defenses even before he was taken to the dungeons. The dungeons beneath Barad-dur were unlike any prison in Middle-earth. They weren't simply places of confinement, but instruments of torture designed to break both body and spirit. The very stones of the walls seemed to absorb hope and radiate despair. The darkness wasn't merely the absence of light, but something actively malevolent that pressed against the mind. Gollum was placed in a cell that had been specifically designed for his interrogation. The floor was covered in a thin layer of water that never seemed to warm, playing on his fish-like nature while denying him any comfort. The walls were smooth and unclimbable, removing his advantage in mobility. Most cruelly of all, the cell was filled with a constant, subtle light that prevented him from finding peace in darkness. Before any physical torture began, Sauron's servants launched a systematic psychological assault on their prisoner. They understood that Gollum's greatest weakness was his obsession with the ring, and they used this knowledge ruthlessly. They would speak of the ring constantly, describing its beauty, its power, and most torturously, suggesting that it was close but forever beyond his reach. The interrogators would alternate between offering hope and crushing it. They would suggest that cooperation might lead to the return of his precious, then laugh at his desperation. They would describe other rings of power, showing him trinkets and baubles, while mocking his attachment to his lost treasure. This psychological torture was perhaps more effective than any physical pain in breaking down his resistance. The most devastating aspect of Gollum's interrogation came when Sauron himself spoke to the prisoner. The Dark Lord didn't appear physically. His presence was felt rather than seen, a crushing weight of malevolent will that pressed against Gollum's already fractured psyche. When Sauron spoke, it was with a voice that seemed to come from the very foundations of the tower, resonating through stone and bone alike. Sauron's interrogation was masterful in its simplicity. He didn't threaten or cajole, he simply commanded, and his will was so powerful that resistance became almost impossible. The Dark Lord knew exactly which questions to ask, and how to phrase them to extract the maximum information. He understood that Gollum's fractured personality could be exploited, turning his internal conflicts against him. Under this relentless pressure, Gollum's carefully guarded secrets began to spill out. He revealed the story of how he had acquired the ring centuries ago, killing his friend Deagol for the precious treasure. He described his long years of possession, the power it had given him, and the way it had preserved his miserable life far beyond its natural span. Most dangerously, he revealed the circumstances of losing the ring, the story of the riddle game with Bilbo, the invisible thief, and the name Baggins, all poured out under Sauron's irresistible questioning. With growing horror, even in his broken state, Gollum realized that he was giving his captors the very information they needed to reclaim the ring. The most devastating moment came when Sauron revealed his own identity to his prisoner. Gollum had known he was in the hands of a great power, but the realization that he was speaking to the ring's original creator, the Dark Lord himself, shattered what remained of his sanity. The creature understood with perfect clarity that he had betrayed the location of the One Ring to its maker. This revelation brought with it the crushing weight of despair. Gollum realized that his precious would never be returned to him, that his centuries of obsession had led only to this moment of ultimate betrayal. The psychological impact of this realization was more devastating than any torture, leaving him a broken shell of his former self. With Gollum's secrets extracted, Sauron had achieved perhaps his greatest intelligence, victory since his return. He now knew not only that the One Ring still existed, but who possessed it, and roughly where they could be found. The name Baggins, and the knowledge that this was a hobbit from the Shire, gave him a clear target for his forces. This information transformed Sauron's entire strategic position. Where before he had been searching blindly for his lost ring, he now had specific intelligence that could guide his actions. He could begin planning operations to recover the ring, and more importantly, he could start eliminating the threats that stood between him and his ultimate goal of dominating Middle-earth. Armed with Gollum's revelations, Sauron immediately began planning operations to locate and attack the Shire. His intelligence network, already extensive, was redirected toward gathering information about hobbits and their homeland. Spies were dispatched to the borders of the Shire, and plans were made for a swift strike that would recover the ring before its bearers could mount any effective resistance. The Dark Lord's approach was characteristically thorough. He didn't simply plan to send a raiding party to grab the ring. He planned a complete campaign that would eliminate any possibility of the ring being hidden or defended. The peaceful hobbits of the Shire would face the full might of Mordor's armies, and they had no idea what was coming. Gollum's interrogation revealed more than just the ring's location. It provided Sauron with crucial intelligence about the ring's current state and the nature of its bearer. The Dark Lord learned that the ring was being carried by someone who didn't understand its true power, someone who used it occasionally but hadn't been completely corrupted by it. This knowledge was both encouraging and concerning for Sauron. On one hand, it meant that the ring hadn't been claimed by a powerful enemy who might use it against him. On the other hand, it suggested that the current bearer might be more unpredictable than someone fully under the ring's influence. This intelligence would shape how Sauron approached the problem of recovering his lost treasure. After extracting everything useful from Gollum, Sauron made a calculated decision to release his prisoner. This wasn't mercy, it was strategy. The Dark Lord understood that a broken, desperate Gollum might still be useful as an unwitting agent. The creature's obsession with the ring made him predictable, and his knowledge of the ring's location made him a potential guide. The release was carefully orchestrated to appear accidental while actually being completely controlled. Gollum was allowed to escape during a transfer, giving him the illusion that he had outwitted his captors while actually playing directly into their hands. The broken creature fled from Mordor, carrying with him not just his own torment, but the seeds of Sauron's victory. Perhaps most importantly, Sauron had created a psychological weapon in the broken Gollum. The creature's experience in Barad-dur had shattered his already fragile psyche, but it had also filled him with a desperate need to reclaim his precious before Sauron could get it. This desperation would drive him to increasingly extreme actions, making him both more dangerous and more useful to the Dark Lord's plans. The trauma of his capture and interrogation had also made Gollum more susceptible to the ring's influence when he eventually encountered it again. His psychological defenses had been systematically destroyed, leaving him vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who understood how to exploit his obsessions and fears. With the intelligence gathered from Gollum's interrogation, Sauron was able to launch one of his most significant operations, sending the Nazgul to the Shire. These 9 ring wraiths, his most powerful servants, were dispatched with a clear mission: find the hobbit called Baggins and recover the One Ring at any cost. The Nazgul's journey to the Shire represented the first direct action of what would become the War of the Ring. Their very presence in the peaceful lands of Barad-dur brought terror and corruption, awakening ancient fears and forcing the free peoples to confront the reality of Sauron's return. What had been a hidden conflict was now becoming an open war. Gollum's captured intelligence transformed the nature of the conflict between good and evil in Middle-earth. What had been a gradual build-up of tensions and a slow increase in Sauron's power suddenly became an active hunt for the most powerful artifact in existence. The stakes had been raised to their absolute maximum. The wise, including Gandalf and Elrond, found themselves forced to accelerate their own plans. The comfortable assumption that they had time to prepare for Sauron's eventual return was shattered by the realization that he already knew where to find his greatest weapon. The formation of the Fellowship of the Ring became not just advisable, but absolutely essential. The information extracted from Gollum also corrupted what might have been a more straightforward conflict. Instead of facing an enemy who was searching blindly for his lost power, the free peoples now faced an opponent who knew exactly where that power could be found. This knowledge gave Sauron significant advantages in planning his strategy and deploying his forces. Moreover, Gollum's broken state meant that he would continue to be a factor in the conflict. His obsession with the ring made him both a potential ally and a certain enemy to whoever carried it. The psychological damage inflicted during his interrogation ensured that he would never be fully trustworthy, creating additional complications for anyone who encountered him. From a strategic perspective, Gollum's capture and interrogation had shifted the balance of power significantly towards Sauron. The Dark Lord now had specific objectives rather than general goals, allowing him to focus his resources more effectively. He could plan operations with clear targets, rather than conducting broad searches across all of Middle-earth. This intelligence advantage also allowed Sauron to begin psychological warfare against his enemies. By demonstrating his knowledge of the ring's location through the actions of the Nazgul, he could spread fear and uncertainty among the free peoples. They would understand that their most precious secret had been compromised, undermining their confidence in their ability to resist his power. The effects of Gollum's capture extended far beyond the immediate intelligence it provided. The creature's experience in Barad-dur shaped his behavior for the remainder of his existence, making him both more dangerous and more desperate. His testimony under torture would continue to influence Sauron's actions throughout the War of the Ring. Perhaps most significantly, the broken Gollum who emerged from Sauron's dungeons was the same creature who would eventually guide Frodo and Sam through the paths of Mordor. His psychological state, shaped by his torture and interrogation, would play a crucial role in the ultimate fate of the ring. In a very real sense, Sauron had created the instrument of his own destruction through his treatment of his prisoner. The greatest irony of Sauron's capture and interrogation of Gollum lay in its ultimate consequences. While the Dark Lord believed he had gained crucial intelligence that would guarantee his victory, he had actually set in motion the events that would lead to his defeat. The broken creature he released would eventually become the unwitting agent of the ring's destruction. Sauron's treatment of Gollum revealed a fundamental flaw in the Dark Lord's understanding of power and loyalty. He believed that through torture and domination, he could extract what he needed and then discard his victims without consequences. But Gollum's obsession with the ring ran deeper than fear of Sauron, and this obsession would ultimately prove more powerful than the Dark Lord's threats. The intelligence victory that seemed so complete was actually corrupted by the very methods used to achieve it. Sauron's torture had driven Gollum beyond rational thought, making his testimony less reliable than it appeared. The creature's broken psyche meant that his motivations were no longer predictable, creating variables that the Dark Lord couldn't account for in his planning. Moreover, the psychological damage inflicted on Gollum created a wildcard element in the conflict. While Sauron believed he understood how the creature would behave, the reality was that Gollum's shattered mind would make choices that defied all logical prediction. This unpredictability would prove crucial at the moment of the ring's ultimate fate. Gollum's capture and interrogation demonstrated the limits of Sauron's philosophy of absolute domination. The Dark Lord believed that sufficient pressure could break anyone, extract any information, and bend any will to his purpose. But Gollum's obsession with the ring created a core of resistance that even Sauron's power couldn't completely overcome. This resistance wasn't noble or heroic. It was the desperate clinging of a broken creature to the only thing that gave his existence meaning. But it was also genuine, and it created a point of unpredictability that would ultimately contribute to Sauron's downfall. The very completeness of Gollum's corruption made him paradoxically more dangerous to his tormentor. The interrogation revealed not just Gollum's secrets, but also the true nature of his relationship with the ring. Sauron learned that the creature's attachment wasn't simply greed or desire for power. It was a fundamental part of his identity that couldn't be severed without destroying him completely. This knowledge should have warned the Dark Lord about the unpredictable nature of ring-bearers. Instead, Sauron interpreted this information as confirmation of the ring's power and his ultimate victory. He failed to understand that such complete obsession created its own form of resistance, not to the ring's power, but to anyone who threatened to take it away. This blindness would prove fatal when Gollum finally encountered the ring again in the fires of Mount Doom. The torture Gollum endured in Barad-dur left scars that went far deeper than physical pain. The psychological techniques employed by Sauron's servants were designed not just to extract information, but to break the victim's spirit completely. These methods created lasting changes in Gollum's personality and behavior that would influence every subsequent encounter he had. The creature that emerged from Sauron's dungeons was even more fractured than before. Where once he had been tormented primarily by his loss of the ring, he now carried additional layers of trauma and terror. The memory of his time in Barad-dur became another voice in his already crowded internal dialogue, adding to his madness while also shaping his desperate schemes. One of the most significant effects of Gollum's torture was the way it intensified his fear of Sauron. While he had always been a cowardly creature, his experience in the Dark Tower elevated this fear to an almost supernatural level. The very thought of returning to Barad-dur became more terrifying to him than death itself. This fear would later play a crucial role in his interactions with Frodo and Sam. His terror of Sauron made him genuinely helpful in guiding them through Mordor, as he was desperate to avoid any encounter with the Dark Lord's servants. Paradoxically, his trauma made him a more effective guide for those seeking to destroy his beloved ring. Rather than breaking Gollum's obsession with the ring, his torture had actually intensified it. The experience of having his secrets torn from him by force made him even more protective of what remained of his inner self. The ring became not just his precious treasure, but his last refuge from the horror he had experienced. This deepened obsession made Gollum more dangerous, but also more predictable in some ways. His desperate need to reclaim the ring before Sauron could get it drove him to take risks he might never have considered before. The torture had stripped away many of his survival instincts, leaving only the burning need to recover what he had lost. Ironically, Sauron's successful extraction of information from Gollum created a form of strategic blindness. The Dark Lord became so focused on the intelligence he had gained that he failed to consider how his methods of obtaining it might affect future events. He treated Gollum as a disposable source of information, rather than recognizing him as a continuing factor in the conflict. This blindness extended to Sauron's understanding of the ring itself. The torture had revealed the depth of Gollum's obsession, but it had failed to show the Dark Lord how such obsession might ultimately serve purposes beyond his control. The very completeness of his victory in breaking Gollum contained the seeds of his ultimate defeat. The capture and torture of Gollum by Sauron represents one of the most important, yet overlooked events in the history of Middle-earth. This forgotten chapter laid the foundation for everything that followed, from the Nazgul's hunt in the Shire to the ultimate destruction of the ring in Mount Doom. Understanding this event is crucial to understanding how the War of the Ring truly began. What makes this story so fascinating is how it reveals the complex relationship between victory and defeat, between gaining power and losing control. Sauron's triumph in breaking Gollum and extracting his secrets was complete and devastating, yet it ultimately contributed to his own destruction. The Dark Lord's methods revealed as much about his weaknesses as they did about his strengths. The intelligence that Sauron gained from Gollum's torture came at a price he didn't recognize at the time. By breaking his prisoner so completely, he had created an unpredictable element that would continue to influence events long after the interrogation was over. The knowledge was accurate, but the source was irreparably damaged, and that damage would have consequences no one could foresee. This story serves as a reminder that in Tolkien's world, the means used to achieve an end often shape that end in unexpected ways. Sauron's use of torture and domination to gain what he needed ultimately created the conditions for his defeat. The very completeness of his power became a source of blindness that prevented him from seeing the true consequences of his actions. The torture of Gollum in Barad-dur stands as one of the darkest chapters in Middle-earth's history, yet it also reveals the paradoxical nature of evil's relationship with its own power. Sauron believed that absolute control would guarantee absolute victory, but Gollum's broken obsession proved stronger than the Dark Lord's dominion. As we reflect on this forgotten chapter, we're reminded that even in Tolkien's world of clear moral distinctions, the path from darkness to light is often complex and unexpected. The creature who betrayed the ring's location under torture would ultimately be the one to ensure its destruction. The victim would become, in his own twisted way, the ultimate victor. The next time you watch or read about Gollum's final moments in Mount Doom, remember the torture chamber in Barad-dur where it all began. Remember that his desperate grab for the ring wasn't just the action of an obsessed creature, but the final act of a being whose very soul had been shaped by unspeakable trauma. In destroying himself and the ring, Gollum found a form of redemption that even he couldn't have planned. This forgotten chapter reminds us that in Middle-earth, as in our own world, the greatest victories often come from the most unexpected sources. Evil's very certainty in its methods can become the foundation of its downfall, and even the most broken beings can play a role in the triumph of good. Thank you for joining me in uncovering this dark but crucial chapter of Middle-earth's history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Tolkien's hidden stories, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We have many more forgotten tales waiting to be explored. Until next time, may the light of Arendil guide you through the darkness.